Imagine a continent torn apart by war, divided by kingdoms, religions, and ideologies. A place where emperors rose and fell, where nations were born in blood, and where the fate of the world was often decided. Now picture that very same continent. Centuries later, signing treaties, building shared institutions, and forming an alliance so powerful that it became one of the greatest economic and political unions in human history. How did this happen? How did Europe transform from the chaos of ancient Rome's collapse to the modern European Union we know today? That is the journey we are about to take. It all begins, not in Brussels or Strasbourg, but in Rome. 2,000 years ago, Roman Empire stood as the most powerful force Europe had ever seen. Rome's legions stretched from the deserts of the Middle East to the rainy shores of Britain. Its roads tied the continent together, its laws standardized justice, and its culture spread across vast distances. Rome wasn't just a city, it was an idea. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, brought order to a fractured world. But even this empire was not eternal. By the 5th century AD, cracks began to appear. Barbarian invasions, internal corruption, and economic collapse brought the empire to its knees. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially fell. For Europe, this was more than the end of an empire. It was the beginning of what many would call the Dark Ages. The continent fragmented into tribal kingdoms. Roads crumbled, trade routes withered, and cities shrank. Life became local, survival became everything, and the grand unity that Rome had once provided was gone. But this wasn't the end of Europe. Out of the ruins, new powers emerged. The Franks under Charlemagne carved out an empire that would later be seen as the foundation of both France and Germany. The Catholic Church became the unifying spiritual authority, binding together kingdoms through faith. Yet unity was always fragile. Crusades, feudal wars, and rivalries kept Europe divided. Still, something was brewing beneath the surface in identity. A shared sense of destiny that would take centuries to form. The Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries reignited Europe. From Florence to Paris, scholars rediscovered the wisdom of Greece and Rome. Art, science, and literature flourished. But along with intellectual rebirth came political ambition. The age of exploration launched European ships across the oceans, establishing colonies and empires. Spain, Portugal, France, and England became global powers. Europe no longer looked inward, it looked outward, dominating trade and reshaping the world. But the seeds of conflict were everywhere. As kings centralized power, wars of religion tore states apart. The Protestant Reformation split Christianity in two, pitting Catholics against Protestants in brutal wars that would last a century. Then came the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu challenged kings and priests, demanding liberty, equality, and rational governance. The American Revolution borrowed these ideas. The French Revolution turned them into a radical upheaval, shaking Europe to its core. Suddenly, monarchs across the continent feared for their thrones. The French Revolution led directly to Napoleon Bonaparte, who declared himself emperor and sought to unite Europe once again, this time, not through peace, but through conquest. Napoleon's wars devastated the continent. From Spain to Russia, his armies marched, spreading revolutionary ideals, but also causing immense destruction. For a moment, it seemed Europe might finally be unified under one ruler. But his defeat in 1815 at Waterloo ended that dream. Instead, the Congress of Vienna tried to restore balance, redrawing borders and reinstating monarchies. For the next century, Europe would be a chessboard of alliances, rivalries, and fragile peace. But the 19th century wasn't just about kings and wars. It was also the century of nationalism. Italians dreamed of a united Italy. Germans dreamed of one German nation. By 1871, both dreams came true. Italy and Germany became powerful new states. Europe now had old empires, Britain, France, Austria, Russia clashing with new ones. The balance was unstable and the competition fierce. Industrialization gave armies new weapons. Colonies gave nations resources and pride. The continent was a powder keg, and in 1914, it exploded. World War I was Europe's greatest catastrophe. Millions of men died in trenches. Old empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, even the Russian, collapsed. The Treaty of Versailles ended the war, but left bitterness, especially in Germany. The so-called war to end all wars was anything but. Within 2 decades, Europe descended into an even bloodier conflict, World War II. This time, the devastation was total. Cities lay in ruins, economies shattered, and tens of millions were dead. The Holocaust revealed the darkest depths of human cruelty. For centuries, Europe had dominated the globe, but now it was broken. Power shifted across the oceans to the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War divided Europe into 2 camps, east and west. The Iron Curtain split the continent. Berlin, once the heart of Europe, became a symbol of division. Yet out of the ashes came something extraordinary. Leaders in the West began asking, how do we stop this from happening again? How do we ensure that European nations, once bitter enemies, never go to war with each other again? The answer began modestly in coal and steel. In 1951, 6 countries, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, formed the European Coal and Steel Community. The idea was simple. If nations shared the industries needed for war, they could never fight each other again. But the vision didn't stop there. In 1957, these nations signed the Treaty of Rome, creating the European Economic Community. Trade barriers fell. Economies grew. Trust deepened. Over the decades, more nations joined. Britain, once skeptical, entered in 1973. Spain, Portugal, and Greece, freed from dictatorships, joined in the 1980s. By 1992, the Maastricht Treaty transformed the EEC into the European Union, a single market, a shared parliament, and later, even a common currency, the euro. For the first time since Rome, Europe was united not by conquest, not by empire, but by choice. And this union became one of the most remarkable success stories of the modern age. The EU turned a continent once defined by war into one defined by peace and cooperation. Former enemies like France and Germany became partners. Eastern European nations, freed from Soviet control after 1989, rushed to join. By the 21st century, the European Union had become a superpower in trade, diplomacy, and culture. But the story isn't over. Just like Rome, the EU faces challenges. Economic crises, debates over sovereignty, the migration crisis. Brexit all test the strength of this union. Can Europe remain united in the face of nationalism, global competition, and internal division? That is the question of our age. From Rome's legions to Brussels treaties, from emperors to parliaments, Europe's story is one of rise, fall, and rebirth. A continent that once tore itself apart has built one of the greatest experiments in cooperation the world has ever seen. The future remains uncertain, but the dream that began in Rome of a united Europe still lives on.